So we have the National Forest Management Act, which required that each forest have its own specific plan for management. And since the law was passed, programs to manage wildlife, non-game animals, and endangered species have been developed. So an example is that there's nesting trees for an endangered bird, for example, may be marked with bands of white paint so that people know that the birds are nesting there and they're going to leave them alone. They're not going to change anything around them and protect them. There's also a set of approaches called New Forestry. New Forestry, so forestry is a method to cut down trees and still maintain them, tries to make harvesting mimic natural disturbance such as a windstorm. And one of the ways that they do this is what's called sloppy clear cutting, which is basically that you would do a clear cut, but you would leave a variety of trees there, which would actually mimic if there was a natural disaster, like a windstorm or a fire or something like that, because not every single tree is usually going to be gone. So by leaving a random variety, we're mimicking the natural disturbances in hopes to maintain as much of a semblance of the natural forest as we can. So in 2001, Bill Clinton was the president then, and he issued an executive order called the Roadless Rule that placed about a third of national forests off limits to road construction. So it was 23.7 million hectares, which was 30% of forest land and about 2% of the total U.S. land that we couldn't build roads on, we couldn't do any construction on, and so obviously no logging on that. And it was really well received. People really liked it. Then in 2005, George W. Bush repealed it, which said that states would be allowed to decide for themselves if they were going to manage the national forest system boundaries. And there was not, a lot of states didn't really like that. And then most of the rule was reinstated when Obama was back, or when Obama was in presidency. So forest fires are a thing that happen naturally in forests. But for most of the time that the Forest Service has been around, they try to suppress the forest fire whenever it broke out to not let it happen. But the problem is that scientists now realize that fire is a really important part of forest ecology. They happen naturally, and forests are resilient and able to rebound after them. There's actually a lot of different types of plants whose seeds need to experience a fire before they are able to germinate. So by completely reducing forest fires, we are actually hurting the forests. And so fire suppression has, and then what happens is if we don't let any fires happen, then we are allowing all this overgrowth to happen. All the shrubbery grows, all the leaf litter builds up. So if by chance then a fire does manage to break out, it's much, much, much worse than if it had happened naturally. And so what happens if we don't allow forest fires is that grasslands become replaced by shrubs because the natural cycle of grassland forest fires allows them to maintain the way they are. And then we may also see invasive plants moving in, and then we would find animal diversity and abundance declining as they're outcompeted. And these days, fire control is actually half of the U.S. Forest Service budget. Over the history of the U.S., we have started building. We're running out of space in the desirable areas that people want to live, so we start building closer along forested land, and so that's called the wildland-urban interface, so where they meet, and that has put a lot of homes in fire-prone situations. That's what, during the Woolsey Fire, all of those homes in the Malibu Hills, they're in the middle of a forest. It's not a national forest, but it's a forest, and so when the forest goes up in flames, so do the houses. So a lot of times land management will do what's called prescribed burns, which is an intentionally set low-intensity fire. So the firemen will come out and intentionally set a fire that they can control. And what that does is it will burn down a lot of the fuel in case another fire comes through. There's not as much for the fire to burn, so it's not going to be as big. They're going to do it to protect property and improve forest conditions. This helps clear fuel loads like we talked about. It helps nourish the soil with ash. So when ash is formed from burning wildlife or from burning plants, there's still a lot of nutrients in there, so we're returning the nutrients to the soil, allowing it to keep being fertile, and it encourages the vigorous new growth of new vegetation. However, it's super expensive and time-consuming, so we only do it on a small percentage of land. Back in 2003, there were some pretty major wildfires here in California, like there are often, but there were very big ones then, and that led to the passage of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which promoted prescribed burns, like we just talked about, physical removal of underbrush and dead trees, so those are the things that are going to be fuel for the fire, and the practice of salvage logging, where fallen trees are removed after a large storm. So this has short-term value. We're preventing major forest fires. However, by removing the underbrush and the dead trees and the fallen trees, we are those things have large ecological value, right? They're the microhabitats, lots of things live in dead trees, and so we're still altering the ecosystem by doing this, even though we're preventing forest fires. And then we also have climate change and pest outbreaks that are altering forests. So climate change has brought warmer, drier weather to the American West, worsening fire risks. So if we have really dry winters, which we did for several years, we're not as much in a drought anymore because of 2 winters ago we had a very rainy winter. But if we don't get any rain, then all that means is that everything is dry and more likely to burn up. And then if we have a one random wet winter, that next fire season is going to be really bad because we have everything grew even more. So by the global, the warming of the temperatures is worsening fire risks. And then we also have pine bark beetle outbreaks that have become much worse, which are killing billions of conifer trees. Conifer trees are, I believe they're the Christmas trees, leaving them, and so then they're dead trees, which are really easy to catch on fire. So that's not good. And the reason that the pine bark beetle outbreaks have worsened is there's 2 of them. When we plant even aged forests, so we're planting all the seedlings at the same time, they're growing up at the same time, that have high numbers of trees that are the same species, it's really easy for them. They're the perfect age for beetle infestation. And they're all the same species. There's not as much variety. There's not as much genetic diversity, so they could all be overtaken by the beetles. And mild winters allow for the beetles, because of climate change, allow for the beetles to overwinter further north than usual, and warmer summers increase their activity and feeding rates. So they have a wider range now because they can live in warmer places that were cold before. And what's happening is maybe the beetle was on an every other, like a 2-year life cycle, and then they switch to a 1-year life cycle, which means they can replicate more. Some beetles have started having 2 spawning events, so like having 2 clutches, giving birth to lots of babies twice in a summer instead of once because it's warmer. So because of the climate change and our even age plantations, it's increased like crazy. So sustainable forest practices are gaining ground. We have organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council, which examines practices of timber companies and rates them. Sustainable forest certification is granted to companies whose methods are judged to be sustainable. So sustainable forest practices would be things like reducing impacts on land, water, and wildlife, conserving resources rather than depleting them, and enabling people to make a living from timber harvesting in the long term. And that is the end of forest management.